Professor, I must ask you, first of all, in what ways has the pandemic changed your approach to work?
Well, of course, there was changes that had to be made to how we work every day, because our business in the JPAL network is to collect data from poor people around the world. And so that involved going to their houses, and we couldn't do that. So the first change was to move to, almost overnight, to collect data by phone. But that was not perhaps the biggest change. The biggest change, it was, okay, how can we put everything aside and mobilize all of our resources on the ground to be as effective as possible, as quickly as possible, to help countries deal with the pandemic, and for the countries in which we work, the poorest country in the world, the economic fallout of the pandemic. So this is a bit like turning a gigantic ship on a dime. And I must say, we are pretty happy with what our network was able to achieve.
Policymakers, what can they do more or indeed better to perhaps alleviate global poverty that hasn't been done? What's being overlooked?
Details. You hear a lot of great ideas. So education is important, democracy is important, corruption is bad. But you never, or very rarely, hear about how, in the detail, how we're going to implement these policies. If we talk about education, how many schools, how many teachers, how long should people stay? Should education be free? Should it be public? Should it be private? So going to the details, this is what, in my experience, makes all the difference. And detailed thinking, careful implementation thinking is what policymakers must focus more on.
So looking at the poor areas of the world, which really suffered the worst, if you like, from COVID-19, what could policymakers do, for example, in terms of, and how is that informing your research? What have you changed in your research and policy ideas that maybe could really inform governments to maybe change these poor communities really suffering from this COVID-19 pandemic?
I think one of the biggest idea that was already there before the pandemic, but has really emerged as something absolutely essential, is the role of emergency cash transfers. Too often, our social policies in poor countries have many hoops that people must jump in order to access the help. And what we've realized during the pandemic, that the biggest risk was not the risk of including someone who is not deserving, but excluding someone who really needs help. And I think what we've learned from the pandemic and will stay with us is the key importance of simplification and efficiency in reaching people who need help in catastrophic circumstances.
And also looking at the metrics that governments follow, governments are often obsessed by GDP growth figures. Is it the right figure to follow given the current global crisis? Or is it misleading?
It is very misleading to focus exclusively on GDP. I don't want to say that it's something you should pay no attention to, because GDP, of course, translates into income, which translates into what people, have in their wallet and can eat every day. But it is just one of the measures that matter. I think the biggest mistake that has been done there is not to pay attention to GDP, but it's to pay attention to GDP only, and also to focus on growth as opposed to levels. So that country like Japan, which became fabulously rich per capita, became suddenly very worried because their growth was not as fast as it had been in the future, and started making all sorts of policy gestures, which we now understand were mistakes, in the pursuit of growth. And this is a story that has been repeated again and again, both in rich countries and in poor countries, in the effort of achieving growth in GDP, doing all sorts of mistakes that have actually reduced everybody's well-being. So I think we need to, number one, not focus just on growth, but also on level. And number two, not focus just on GDP, but on a richer measure of welfare, including mortality, including life expectancy, including people's chance to get an education, which is a good one, and so on and so forth.
What about debt? Obviously, there are rising levels of global debt ratio, if you like, against growth. Is it many are saying irresponsible to borrow to push you out of a crisis, or is it the right way to do it at the moment? I mean, if debt balloons, which it has done in many countries, what happens thereafter? 2 years' time, 5 years' time, when really that debt would be a massive crunch?
What you have to think about is the counterfactual, which is, given the COVID crisis, what would have happened without the debt? And in fact, we have that counterfactual because the poor countries were absolutely unable to borrow. to get themselves out of the crisis. Whereas the rich countries spent about 20% of GDP in stimulus, the poorest country could spend only 2% because they were unable to borrow. And the big worry I have for the poor countries is that therefore the crisis morphs from an acute crisis due to the lockdown to a much more long-run crisis that doesn't really go away, that transform these immediate shocks into something much more permanent and damaging for generations. And this is what the rich countries, in a sense, mostly avoided by being able to borrow. So in a sense, what I would have liked is for the rich countries to borrow just a little bit more in order to help the poor countries help their citizens at a comparable level.
Are they borrowing enough at the moment or not to help these countries?
They are not doing it. So the poor countries have not received at all the kind of help that would have made it possible for them to help their citizens in the same way. As I was saying, they spend only 2% of their budget, which is much smaller, to help their citizens cope with the economic crisis. So this would have been very little for the rich countries. They could have borrowed just a bit more, or they could have used the proceeds of what they were borrowing slightly differently. I don't think it's almost not a matter of the amount of money given how much was borrowed. It's more a matter of the choice that were made.
And where it goes to.
Exactly, where it goes to. So this is a discussion that we have mostly within countries, where there is a discussion of whether it really goes to help the poorest. And I think some effort has been made in this direction. But I have not seen that conversation taking place across countries to say, is it really fair that we spend 20% on ourselves and we let a poor country spend only 2% on their populations?
Thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.